you have introduced my practice, and that is a method that I'll follow. Also, as per the title that I have given you, Conservation Continued. And it goes on to say preserving heritage in Mumbai. Having known, all of us Mumbaiites, we know that the city is a pioneer in hosting the conservation movement right at the onset. And it is only from Mumbai that the conservation movement and the guidelines, etc., they followed in the rest of the country. So Mumbai is a very proud city to host conservation movement in the country. The pioneering of the urban culture in the city is well known in spite of all the pressures that have been experienced in the city. Mumbai has always been at the forefront in conservation actions. And that is where I set foot into in the about 1980s and 1986 generally. And the journey continued. And that is why I thought I should talk about the journey as a continuation of what has been happening with my life as well as the conservation practice that I follow and the rest of the conservation architects in the city follow. And therefore the term continued is used here. Conservation and preservation is a mixed kind of action taken. And I will explain that a little bit later. But when one looks at my practice, it has always been in the lead to look at the context in which we practice. And so the context actually is tells us what is the understanding of the exact setting of the cultural heritage of that particular asset. And that is how my practice has always looked at in the applicability to see to it that the strategies and solutions are always applicable in the manner in which the site or the asset is understood. And that is also the ethos of conservation, actually. So the context is something that talks always. The historicity of the context is what we look at. We try and understand that context, and the decisions taken are thereby. So one can say that we go by the book to understand the ethos of pursuing conservation for any given asset. And that is what embraces my firm and the way we practice. One can see the team that I represent. It's a team rather than me being the boss and the rest of them being my colleagues. So everything is done together with the team, and it's always a teamwork. Currently, my team comprises of only of girls, which is just a coincidence. It's not that I am averse to architects in the male domain. It's just that it is a coincidence at the moment. So what is conservation practice? What is cultural significance? Is something that remains at the base of our practice and all practices of architects or others who practice in the field of cultural conservation. So one can say that culture includes, as it is said here, groups of peoples or societies, beliefs, traditions, and social behavior. We know that culture has grown out of human achievements, and it can be referred to within the domains of art, culture, literature, music, religion, etc. And that makes the domain of culture, and as a general cultural heritage may be called. It also infers a common bond with our sense of belonging to the community, right? We know, most of us know what is cultural heritage, but if one has to define it, then it can be defined as symbolizing history, identity, our connection to the past and present, and also the future. So the domain is between the past, the present, and the future. And this is what needs to be understood by cultural heritage and its influences, so that one can come into identification of values, which is inherent in the asset, and also makes the right choices. So if one has to understand cultural heritage, it encompasses so many beliefs and understandings. What is conservation then? So conservation then would be to look at a place, culture thrives. What does a place mean then? So a place would mean a site or any area or a building and its associated works, groups of buildings and other works together with associated contents and surrounds. So it has to be looked at as a total setting. Cultural significance is what we thrive on. We try to understand cultural significance being a very technical term used by us. And it means that all the values associated in the past and in the future, which needs to be continued, is understood completely and totally. If one has to write down a statement of cultural significance, then it will look at all the various values that are inherent in the asset. And that is what cultural significance means. The associational values of cultural significance to a place, thus, can become the key feature to understand architectural conservation. But conservation in the built environment, in an ethos like this, may even qualify to negate development, isn't it? So, negating development while attempting conservation becomes debatable. And it is this debate that brings in the aspect of change. How much to change and what to change. That is the aspects that begin. So then, if one defines what is a historic building, a historic building normally is something that all of us view as something that brings in a sense of wonder, normal. And it is a sense of wonder that ideates itself as various values. So the values systems that are built into historic buildings are then architectural, they can be aesthetic, they can be historic, they can be documentary, archaeological, economic, and so on. But at the helm remains the quest to understand your emotions when one looks at it, perceives it, and wants to know more about it. So it is a symbol of continuity and change as a part of our heritage. And why should we conserve? Conservation is, as I said earlier, is debatable. If human life has to continue, then the constant change that is expected out of the regime of built environment has to change. And it is change which needs to be controlled. But why should the change be controlled? That is answered here because communities and humans have an inherent connection to what has been already developed in the past, and it has expressions of its own which needs to be understood. And therefore conservation is something which brings in continuity to human life, and if not all, a part of it which is identified as having cultural significance needs to be retained. So what is conservation? Conservation simply means prevention of decay. Once the identification is done for protection, then the action to prevent the decay of that fabric becomes supreme. And that action of preventing decay is what we understand as conservation. It embraces all the acts that prolong the life of cultural and natural heritage. And what will be the objective? The objective will be to present to those who use and look at historic buildings with a continued wonder at the artistic and the human messages that sense. So, what is conservation? Continues into looking at how the world embraced this aspect of conservation. And it was identified in the statutes of ICOMOS at the level of UNESCO. And what it set out in the year 1978 was to recognize it to be inherent in the monuments, the group of monuments and buildings and sites. So these become the tangible aspects of the identification stock of heritage assets. So one can look at monuments, which are larger works with monumental sculptures and paintings and elements which are at a level of significance, which can be evaluated using some specific scientific processes. So each of these monuments, groups of buildings, and sites, each of these sets can be identified using an understanding and an informed experience. This has been specified very, very technically and scientifically in the statutes of ICOMOS. And that is what is followed by the rest of the world. And that becomes the context of when I say we go by the book, it is this book that we go by. So each time that we take a project, each time we look at an asset which is identified as a heritage asset, this is the list of identifications that we look at and the understanding that we look at. Then what are values? If it is a combination of values that builds up cultural significance, then ICOMOS has identified the set of values under which a scientific study can be undertaken. And if one has to look at them broadly, they would be ranging within the set of emotional values, cultural values, and use values. A combination of all these values together, if they are analyzed, then it gives us a statement of significance of that particular property. And if you look at the text, emotional, cultural, and hues, each of those is again subdivided into subcategories, and it can be studied in detail. The degrees of intervention then. So if you identify the values, how would you intervene in the given set of settings or a building or a group of buildings or even at a city level? How do you do that? And what is the degree of intervention that is supposed to be attended to or executed? So the degrees of intervention again are identified as from 1 to 7. Prevention is one of the highest and the most effective degrees. When you say prevention of deterioration, if one has managed the monument or the group of buildings or the exact asset, if it has been managed properly at a prevention level, then the rate of intervention or the scale of intervention automatically will come down. Preservation of the existing state is something that ASI uses very, very efficiently. So if you look at the terms, it says prevention of deterioration, preservation, consolidation, restoration, rehabilitation, reproduction, and reconstruction. These are the various scales that are applied of intervention to the given asset. All these can be, as it is said further, that the various degrees of interventions listed above may take place simultaneously in various parts of a major conservation project. And if you go and look back at the title that I have given to my presentation, it says conservation continued. And in the same breath, it says preservation. The meaning is very clear here. So the degrees of intervention that get effective in any given set of identified object or an asset, then any of these can be applicable depending upon the understanding of that particular asset and the experience of the person who's executing the project. What I'm only trying to say is that all these processes are what we follow in every project. So it's sometimes very difficult to say which is the intervention that is being followed exactly for any one part of the building that we look at. And this is a practice that you will see in each of the projects that I'm going to share with you. So conservation is a process of maintaining and managing change. As I'm saying that managing change is something that is supreme in the aspect of looking at the actions, any of the actions that are going to be undertaken for the particular asset. Preservation means and includes maintaining the fabric of a place in its existing state and retarding deterioration. So one is only looking at the various degrees of change that one has to control while undertaking conservation. So what are the steps? The steps are these: assess the value, establish cultural significance, provide a sound base for conservation. And once that is done, one can list it under different approaches. And the approaches can be repairs and restoration. They can be undertaken adaptive reuse. It can be a protection of monuments or providing planning policy guidelines if the setting is larger than a single group of buildings. And it allows for contextual additions and alterations as well, what we call as inserts, new design inserts into a set of given context. And this is the experience that I will take you through the different contexts that I'm going to talk about. And so we are looking at glimpses of various contexts. Very easily you will see them in each of the projects that I'm going to talk about. The issues that prevail within those contexts. What are the losses that the context has already undergone? Because only after understanding the losses that one can take the next step of conservation. What governs the undertaking of the processes? Definitely economics. It is only funding given to the processes or the funds available to the processes that will make it possible. Are there design opportunities within the regime of conservation? Absolutely, there is. And you'll see them presented in each of the cases. And to understand thereby the need to conserve. And the story continues of applicability. And this is what we go by always. This is what I say, we go by the book. Get to know your building. Define a philosophical approach. Once you do that, you know what a defensible solution should be so that the rate of change is controlled and the asset does not change completely and does not change telling the story correctly. Then there are pre-site preparations, going to the site, look at the data, build up a data, make drawings, analyze the data. So from understanding to analyzing to approaching and applicating. So all these are processes. There are on-site approaches, there are off-site approaches. This is a sketch that my guide had given it to me, and I really go by it, always. So one looks at, how does one look at a building, and so where does one start from? So one will start from the roof, comes down to the base, comes down to the foundations, then looks at the walls, look at all the assets contained within the fabric, and so on, and look at every element that is composed within the building set. Then one has to, because we are looking at, as I said, delay of or arrest the decay. And if it is arresting the decay, then one has to understand what is decay caused by. And so causes of deterioration, which could be intrinsic to the building as belonging to, as you can see, the topographical, climatic, or orientation, or ground carrying foundations, building materials, building systems, and so on. Or they can be extrinsic, which are caused by climatic conditions externally after the building is built, or it can also be caused by human activity. And it is this human activity which is the most dangerous, because if it is done without understanding, it causes deterioration. And so this is the approach to conservation holistically. You put the building, the historic building, in the center and look around it and look at the various aspects that need to be understood and taken forth. And so based on that, this understanding, which is applicable to all the projects that we do. And now we start with one context. The context number one is Ismail building. Ismail building is something that everybody knows about. People in Mumbai know about it, especially because it is set in the core of the city, just at Flora Fountain. It is famously known as Zara building. I refuse to use that name because buildings have their own names. It is the use of the building that changes its name. And that is a very human tendency to do, because one understands a setting by its use. And that is the reason why names change. So again, human activity and the way a human being relates to a space or an asset or a building. The term Flora Fountain and the term fort precinct has stayed on historically. Is there a fort here anymore? No, there isn't. It has been demolished years ago, 1850s actually. And yet the name remains embedded in the memory of people. And that is what I'm talking about. Human connections, human attachments, sense of memory, and the sense of belonging is something that is so supreme in a human psyche. And therefore, it should be conserved. So if you look at the journey that one goes through, and I'll go quickly through each of the projects, what you have to do is to recall what I have said at the onset. The understanding of the building, the way conservation architects look at it, the way they understand, analyze, identify causes of decay, and try and restrict or put a restraint to the changes that happen in the decay pattern. So that is something that you will have to carry with you as a story as you look at the projects. That is what I would advise you. Adaptive reuse is something that was very, very identifiable in the case of Ismail building. All these buildings which are identified as heritage assets usually suffer from economical viability. Where does economical viability come in? It comes in through a use. And therefore, if the asset is reused in a different manner from its original use, then it brings in some kind of economic viability to it. And therefore, adaptive reuse becomes viable. Cultural significance is what I started with, and all my projects will start with identification of cultural significance. So history of the place and its setting, and you can see the fort, and you can see the setting here, the yellow little tag. When the fort walls were there, this was a location. You see it after the fort walls were removed, and you see it in the current situation of the city survey. And you forget that the fort existed right there at the doorstep of the building. And so those are the memories which build in the cultural significance. And therefore one looks at history and one looks at the different images and researches these images and goes through the journey of how it would have been before, during, after, and currently. What are the situations? This gives us as conservation architects a base of understanding the building and the manner in which it has changed over a period. So history and research becomes a kind of a gateway for conservation architects and also helps in building up the cultural significance as a scientific statement. So one can look at this. So Ismail building is set like this. It has a main building. It has a toilet block at the back. What you see on the right-hand side is how it looked when I found it. Ismail building for me has been a very long journey because I was associated as a conservation architect much before I started the restoration in this particular phase, because one of the reasons was my chartered accountant sat in this building and I used to visit it, and the story goes on. I was also asked by the occupants of the building about 10 years before I started this particular restoration to restore it. It didn't happen. And it was written on my forehead that I'm supposed to do it. And therefore, it came into my lap and the journey continued. What does one look at? It looks at the state of decay. That is what a doctor would do when a patient comes to the doctor, isn't it? The person is sick. In this case, the building is sick. And the building wants to be looked at from that point of view. And so one looks at the decay pattern and looks at what was the construction made up of, why was it failing, how was it failing, what were the aspects because of which it was failing, and so on. One of the common threads for failure patterns that we look at is water ingress. Water ingress from the top at the roof level through the building as it cascades down, and if there's a rising damp coming from the geological formation on which it is set, because the geological formation has been intervened by human beings. The fort walls were demolished. The fort precinct was developed over a period of time. And so there was an upheaval in the geological formations and so on. And this is the story that is to be applied. And we understand the fabric where the losses were. We make drawings, we understand it properly and record it. So recording and documenting begins at the onset. It continues through the process of undertaking the conservation actions, and it even continues throughout the whole journey. And we also record it after. So recording happens before, during, and after. So the same processes that I mentioned earlier: understanding, analyzing, and identifying defects and therefore applicabilities. This is what happened to Zara, because all of you must be wanting to know what happened. And the original building has this set of columns and the walls, etc., which are load-bearing in character. It's an old building. It is made up of bricks, and it has an envelope. Within it is an open office plan. This columns and the foundations and the roof was failing, and so we proposed to alter this entire set, right from the foundations up to the roof, and all the slabs had to be redone completely. The scale of intervention here is extremely high. And why would a conservation architect agree with this? The conservation architect agrees with this in the interest of the lease of life that it can give to the building, to its cultural significance, to its setting at the Flora Fountain, to its cultural significance, to the setting of the entire precinct and the whole fort area, because it stands at a junction which is so significant to the city. And so line of defense is what is built up for any action that one takes. The slabs were undertaken for demolition in a very scientific process, one after the other, in a layered format, while the walls were kind of embedded into a set of scaffolding so that it does not collapse. It was a major scientific intrusion or intervention, as one may call it. This is what we found inside. It was bare bricks, beautiful bricks inside the building. So I'm just showing you the various processes that were undertaken. On the right-hand side, you can see the degrees of intervention that were taken. The window that you see as circular is the oculus window right at the top. And you can see it from inside and outside, and one can understand the construction as well. The other elevations. You can also see that at the bottom, the material is different, inside and outside. It's a beautiful composition of materials and the way it was maneuvered to look aesthetically appealing and also go by the style of the building. This was something that we found, and you can see the before and after and during. So what you see on the left is, if I can share the cursor, wait, no. So I need a cursor. So you have this mound on the left, which is right at the top, and it was completely covered. The photographs that I showed earlier, which were very long shots, still gave me an image, and I knew that there was something inside. And we found a crown, the queen's crown, up there, right on the top, and it was restored. And you can see all the other features that are restored using original material, lime. It was cemented over, it was removed carefully, and lime was brought back. And one can see the skill set of the people who are working. Externally, it was in blue-green basalt. It's a rare combination. And one can see quite a few buildings around this junction, which are in the same stone. So you can see all this, how documentation is done and brought back to life. Many processes can be explained here, but I'm only going by the rate of change which was intervened into each of the contexts. And I'll go only by that. Because if one looks at the scientific processes, each project that I'm showing will take more than 2 hours. And so by decision, I'm not showing it. I'm only talking about the rate of change, the extent of change, and the decisions taken. So you can see that the stone was cleaned properly. Special processes are used here to clean the stone, from steam cleaning to applying special poultices, and then the resurrection, or bringing back to life the quality of the artwork which was there and all the cast iron railings. Most of them were absent and they were brought back. So some more images of how the process was done, how the issues were addressed, and how the solution was offered. And you can see the intermediate stages of work as well. So the same process is here again. I'm only trying to show you the extent of how studies were done to understand the state of decay and the surface finishes. Detailed drawings. There was an annotation that I used earlier. Is design included? Yes, it is included. So whatever was missing, it was designed specifically to be brought back. And the construction material and the manner in which it was reconstructed is new design, which is introduced into the old fabric. And this is how my team was included here. This is my office colleagues who actually put their hands in to do the actual work themselves, to show the working people of the contractor of how to proceed. And some before and after quickly. So this is how the building was. The second building that I would want to look at is Sassoon building. By the way, the listing, the grading which was given to Ismail building is grade 2. It's grade 2B. If you look at this Sassoon building, it is not listed. It's not a listed building. It only sits in the precinct, which is listed. So it sits in the precinct and it sits into the sub-precinct of Kalagoda. So it was the client who understood that this building can be brought back to life and it can give a huge contribution to the precinct itself. He looked at Zara and its resurrection, and that is how he approached me and asked me if I would be able to do this building. And so if you look at the journey again, it's the same identification of cultural significance. The way it is set, which year was it built? I also believe that this building is an original format even when the fort walls existed. This is my conjecture from the various features that I could see within the building. So one can see that in the right-hand side top building, where you can see also the uh, the Esplanade building, which is so famous today, which is under restoration currently. You can see that the building which is marked under red and the roads that you see around it would have been where the fort walls stood directly on it. And that was a junction. It formed. And so I believe with my conjectures, I cannot prove it, but the conjectures are strong. And it says that possibly the building is an original format, even before the fort walls were removed. So that is a setting. We look at history. A close-up of how the building was during that, the earlier image that I showed you. And what I found currently is on the right-hand side. So a lot of changes, but if you look at the format of the windows, the number of floors, the openings, and the small windows right at the top, it all exists even today. So there was a huge amount of intervention done, I think, at the time of when the fort walls were demolished and this was resurrected. A very odd plan form, simply because this building is a part and parcel of a larger cluster of buildings. It stands completely sandwiched, and various little lanes which were a part of the larger cluster has been combined together and converted into a building. And so it today behaves like a larger building. And so if you look at the ground floor, and then you look at the first floor, second floor, third floor, it all weaves into each other. A very difficult building to tackle. And yet we did it. And so these are all the understandings, as I was talking about, identifying the defects, the reason why the defects were existing, and how could they be rectified. And as I said, we start with the roof. And so we started with the roof, and we went down into the buildings. And you can see the various layers of restoration processes happening. Yeah, using the original material, like-to-like materials of the original fabric, which is lime. Lime's concrete, lime in its various forms, because the original building was built in lime. And stone does not behave in the presence of cement. It starts decaying. So if one wants to arrest decay, one will have to remove the later interventions, which have been done under the guise of repair using cement. So what we normally look at as first signs of understanding is, where would cement be? Those are our lifelines. And we understand the state of conservation of the building from these. And so again, one sees brickwork, the amount of restoration that it needed. You can see steel stitching on the left and so on. You can also see it in the arches, and then you can see the finished arch. So it is strengthened, not demolished. Some design interventions were done. When the client entered halfway through, the new user came in and he wanted certain sensibilities, and we allowed those sensibilities. So what you see in the ground floor as built, we allowed him to cut open that little floor portion, so that today when you go inside the stores, you are able to read it as 2 floors, you can see the floor below. It brings in the architectural spatiality in a different format. And we allowed it only with a limitation that he shall not cut or remove any of the structural joists. And that is how it is today. And so you can see how it was resurrected. What you see on the right hand side below is that cutout that was made. And then the new architect entered the scene within the confines of what we had restored. And we worked hand in hand. And so working hand in hand has created this ensemble, as one can call it. And you can see that if you look closely, the timber beams are left out uncarpentered as found. They were not finished. They were not cladded. And the client agreed to this. The new user agreed to this. So it is the sensibilities of the person who walks in and understands that to showcase the original fabric is a one-up, because then the sense of wonder that one possesses is kind of becomes an appetizer, and one looks at it from that point of view and see how beautifully it is done. The interiors are something worth looking at, because the way the spaces are created and the way the walls are clothed, I would say. It's tapestry which is hand painted in a particular art form. And so the story continues of skills, and also restoring that old skill of hand painting in a particular style. And that is what Anita Dongre is famous for. And so one can live this journey through these images. One has to always go into the building to understand what I'm saying. My sessions, which are portrayed here, are never sufficient. It had stained glass on the front facade, and that was brought back. You can see it here in the right-hand side lower frames. And that is also what you see. And this is what I found. I started this. It was a Caracas. And it became this. So one has to stay true to the story of the building and the journey that it has undertaken. Illumination, which is sensitively done, also kind of gives it a sense of joy during the setting sun and in the dark hours. So, and I would pay tribute to my consultant here, Kanchan Puri. She is the consultant for the illumination of this building. And then I think what you are looking for and waiting for here is the Afghan church. I'll stay here a little longer. I think I've crossed my time, but I'll quickly go through it. It's a grade 1 building, very, very important and significant for the whole city. Same process is what you will see. History of the building, historical records are looked at, identification of each of the components that is to be restored, understood, and brought back to life. Here we had a collaboration of various consultants from each expertise. And so we were a group of 7 consultants who looked at the building and its restoration, the scaffolding works, all the restoration processes. One can look at the processes here. There were some great surprises for us at the top here, but all was tackled using conservation processes, and the set of interventions and changes were governed by this. There are a set of 8 bells in the belfry. They were all restored. Structural systems were restored. And today one can go up and look at these systems. They are approachable, but only with permission and with somebody with you, because it's a little difficult to climb. So each of these assets were looked at. There was water, as I said, water dripping in like this. You can see the wetness. In the first monsoon, water came in like a water spout, and all that was restored. I'm only showing you images and the amount of work that goes into the understanding. From the roof to the floor to the furniture to every aspect of this huge asset. All the processes of using original materials, and there you see the finished product. All aspects were dealt with, and again you see how the building comes alive with illumination inside and outside. So that is, and we have set up an interpretation center inside, which raises the quest or queries. The sense of wonder increases inside, and one wants to look at it. Not just the building as it is restored, it wants to go beyond that journey. Afghan church is a war memorial church. So all the regiments, etc., are depicted in the building, in the fabric of the building. And we set up a new plaque of all those who were not listed. And so that came alive. Signage, furniture, and the completion. Stained glass stands supreme. It is one of the best stained glass in the country, and belonging to the original masters in the UK. Swati Chand Gadkar did the stained glass restoration. Anupam Saha did all the artwork, and also mainly this is very important, this particular slide is showing the original colors, flags of the Afghan war, which came back and they are mounted here. These were restored to its original format. These are copies which are mounted up so that it can be shown to people that this is what the design and the significance of the flags was. The original ones which are restored are lying inside in a museum condition in the same building, and upon asking, they can be opened up to see and to view the processes of restoration. Sorry, the choirs come back. This was on the opening day. You're talking of religious buildings. So we spoke about Afghan church and we spoke about Ismail building, which was not religious, but one more religious building. This is the Dongarwadi building. Once again, an associated religious building. It is not per se an area for prayers, but it is for prayers of the people who come to mourn the death of their dear ones. So these are pavilions. They are called pavilions. These are pavilions open for non-Zoroastrians. So non-Zoroastrians who would come to pay respects to their friends and family of mourners. So that is how it is. It's a very rare site, 55 acres of green, verdant forest within which it is set. The tiny red that you see is the only built part. The purple ones are the wells. These are the dogmas, as they are called. That is where the cremation happens. And this was a state of, and one can see again the rate of change that was brought in and enhancement at the end of the day. So the whole thing was enhanced, and what you see at the bottom was an introduction of stained glass, which is talking about the concept of the soul, departed soul, and the journey it takes to its elevation. So this is an introduction, right? And you can see the process. Juma Masjid, I'll just take you through. All of you are welcome. On asking, we can have trips to the Juma Masjid. Once again, a religious building, not an adaptive reuse. So all the religious buildings that we saw are not adaptive reuses. In relation to Zara, in relation to Sasun building. So same operations. This is the understanding, the skill sets that one looks at, the different consultancies that are always required to look at the structural stability. It stands on water, on a water body. So this is where, when the water was removed to inspect the foundations, and the foundations were repaired, and this is how it would stand. This is a picture. The earlier slide was below the arches. It is a 14 feet depth below this water level that you see now. And you can see in the plan how the structural system is at the bottom. The state of deterioration, this is what we found on wanting to understand what the color schemes were. And this was a color scheme that we could unearth. And the clients wanted it to be enhanced. So the enhancement schemes were directly influenced by my clients, who call themselves the friends of Afghan children, or not Afghan children, friends of the Juma Masjid. They were also the funders of the whole process. So we ourselves are trying our hands at various skills. The roof before and after of the surrounding of the water body. So this is the enhancement that happened on the ground floor. There were 7 to 8 layers of oil paint that covered the entire building. None of the original materials were visible. It was only our inspections and understanding that identified the original materials and brought them back to life. And enhanced also. So we could conjecture a few color schemes and brought them back. So if one would ask what to change, how much to change, this is what it can change, as long as the integrity of the building is continued. Chandeliers, which were brought back to life, these were designed by us and executed on site. This is the before and after. Introduction of gold is not a new intervention. It already had a lot of gold leafing. So when we removed the plaster work, we could see the gold leafing. And it must have been much more than what we could kind of give it back. It is 24 karat gold leafing process, which was brought back partly, as much as one can afford to bring it back. Stained glass is an introduction. It did not exist. So these were the kind of justifiable changes and introductions and interventions that we could do. I mentioned the making of the chandelier on site. So the chandelier is about 15 feet by 15 feet, and it can be hoisted up by a winch into the hollows of the roof, and it can be lowered whenever we need it to be maintained, repaired, brought back up to this level and taken back up. So all those systems were engineered, and this is the final outcome that one looks at today. So, Eros, tell me please if I've stopped. I'll just quickly go through this. Eros is something that is right at the center and the heart of everybody. Single screen cinema, which has been vanishing from the scene in a city like Mumbai, which has always been the special place for cinema making and cinema exposing. And single screens have started to vanish. They've already vanished. And here was this client of mine who said, will you do this project? And I said, no, it's a World Heritage site and it's difficult for me to handle it. And there'll be a lot of flack. We may not get permission from the Heritage Committee. He said, why don't you listen to what I'm saying? He said, I want to bring it back. I want to retain the single screen cinema, but in a different way. I need a financial viability. He explained the scheme. I thought it was justifiable, and I agreed. What you see here in the plan is something which is very interesting for the city to look at. It sits inside the whole building that we see. And people think that's the whole cinema house. It is not. It is this little kind of a womb which is inside the whole body, which is the cinema house. The wings that you see in purple are residential wings. A very clever plan by the architect envisaged in that period of time, and still affording light and ventilation and services, etc. So this is what was very surprising for me, and it was very nice to understand the architect's plan. And what was viable to be done eventually is this. And so it was, what was brought back was this. The front is the entrance, which was retained. One goes up the same old hexagonal staircases and the same old hexagonal lifts. Only the rear portion, the main belly of the, is on the ground and the first floor, will allow economical viability by reusing it as a retail space. A conservation architect like myself would ideally cringe at a thought like this, but I did not. I understood that there are various motives here which are so justifiable. And the principal one is that the building in the World Heritage Site is being preserved as it is. The single screen cinema is coming back to life. It is coming back to life with all its principal features and assets. Nothing is removed. Whatever was the experience of the erstwhile cinema goer is still retained. And you'll see how features brought back in a different avatar. So the frozen fountain relief is brought back here in the right-hand side as you enter the cinema house. These were Art Deco floorings, because the principal floor at the bottom had completely given way, and it is marble. How do you restore it? Not possible. And it's a public building. It has been a building which has always been fashionable at its galore and its best. Look-wise, aesthetically, always looking grand and big. And how can you tolerate a floor like that? And so we thought of allowing and enabling a new design in the same sensibility. And this is what we presented to the Heritage Committee. And a permission was given to us to do so. And the new design, which has come up as a collaboration with a design architect here in this case, Hafiz Contractor, was the principal design architect who collaborated actively and brought back this aspect, controlled under the regime of heritage conservation. The rest of the features are maintained intact, as you can see. The floor changes, the false ceiling is still the same. All the other features, they were preserved in situation without removal completely, and they are all maintained. Some new features, the lift doors also kind of looked at Art Deco designs and brought them back. This was the highlight. These are the special bas reliefs which talks about the cinema history. It tells a story of cinema. These were intact. They were documented in several methodologies so that while removal and reapplying in the cinema house again, if anything goes wrong to it, with the process, then we are able to reproduce it. And so they came back in the cinema house, which is upstairs now. These are live from the current and ongoing film which we were looking at. This is how they came back. We were able to retrieve, restore, and put it back. So that's a journey that I would take it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirtida. It was a really interesting behind the scenes look, I guess you could call it, at all these buildings that have been restored. I think everyone's really enjoyed the talk very much. I have a couple of questions if you wanna, can I just jump into it or do you want to break?
Yes, please.
Okay.
No, we can jump in.
Okay, so the first is what role and I think you've addressed this through the talk, but maybe I'm just asking it anyway. What roles do the different stakeholders play in the conservation? Who has the final call and decision-making power in case of multiple opinions?
Final decision is mine, of course.
That's good to know. That's good to know. Okay.
Yeah.
And
No, I'm just joking. So, yes, the stakeholding pattern is supreme because heritage belongs to people.
yeah,
It is their understanding and their perseverance through the journeys. And people want to hear those stories. So, right from the current stakeholders to the past users and to the enormous number of people who have used it through the ages, they all have an equal share. And as conservation architects, we would love to hear from them. So in all the projects, we look for people who have used the places in the past. We talk to them, we hear their stories, and we put them into practice because for us, that is data.
I understand. But I think maybe in terms of, I think what Sukhi is asking is more that like maybe if there's whoever is financing it or whatever, do they have more of a say, less of a say? Or like in the Sassoon building, like you said you did make one compromise at the entrance, but not compromise, just something that worked for everybody. But so who would have those final decisions?
So the final decisions depends on the particular building.
Okay.
Right? Based on that and who becomes the user.
Right.
So they would propose. The proposals come from them.
Yeah.
They have to be understood by us as conservation architects. Because as architects, we are basically trained in design.
Yes.
That is our basic training. So we do understand completely design. And we understand where the proposal is aiming at. So we weigh and balance it. And we put back our proposal saying that if not 100% of yours, can we do it like this? So we come halfway or 3/4 way or whatever.
Oh.
Sometimes we just say no, cannot be done because the philosophy of conservation is not agreeable to us.
Correct.
And we always go by that philosophy. So we, on explaining, people do understand.
I'm sure, yes.
Yes.
And I'm sure they've come in with that intent also. So
yes, right at the onset.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
Sukhi's also asked, and again, I think you've addressed this in part, but like, what do we learn when we open up, so to say, the older buildings? What do you learn, like maybe historically?
Historically, so we are dependent upon a lot of data, which is historic data. So we would understand already that the building was like this. Whatever data we get, which could be like stories, which could be drawings, which could be talking to the users, and so on. So we have understood its path.
Right.
So we are ready for what we will find when we open up. Kind of.
Correct.
So we are ready with that. And so when we open it up, the rate of surprise element is less.
Okay.
But sometimes
been any
it is
great
very
surprise?
high.
Yeah. Have you been
Yes,
had any great
sometimes
surprise?
like the crown that you saw in the Ismail building.
Yes.
It was a tiny picture given to me by a very respected friend of mine who really is a collector of images, old images. And he gave it to me and he said, look at this. And it was a small, tiny thing which you cannot enlarge. But I could see that it was not as flat as what I see today.
Correct.
And then the story continued. And then I went into, why would anybody cover it? So it went back to independence era. When the country gained independence, the mindset of people changed. They didn't
Hmm.
want to see the crown anymore.
Ah, okay. Right.
Interesting. Yeah.
So that is what happened.
Okay. Somebody has Jyoti has asked that the Ismail building. Do you know who built it and for what reason it was built?
So it was built by the Ismail Yusuf Trust. The Ismail Yusuf Trust are into shipping. I think they still own the INS Jawahar as a training ship.
Okay.
So there were merchants at base, merchandise happening in shipping. And so they, being that kind of status in the society, they occupied on the demolition of the fort walls. They wanted to occupy the two principal opposite buildings
Mm-hmm.
in the main avenue of that urban design plan.
Hmm.
So if one looks at the urban design plan, which was prescribed for the city, they wanted that prime location. So it's the Ismail building on the left. The
Hmm.
right-hand side is Yusuf building. So it is
Right.
Ismail Yusuf as a twin buildings
Okay.
on both sides. So
Okay.
they built it, and architects were Mistri in Bedwar. In fact, the same set of architects for Eros,
Okay.
the same set of architects where I'm doing another building, which is the Amar Chand Mansions.
Hmm.
So it's the same set of architects. So
Interesting.
prevalence of
Yeah.
practices in
Yes.
architecture spanning 4 to 5 decades.
Hmm.
And then you see the set of styles which also changed.
Hmm.
So if you look at this building, which is the oldest, Ismail,
Hmm.
and then you go to Eros, 1930s Art Deco. And in between lies Amarchand, which is almost the same age,
Hmm.
but the use is different. This is merchandise building.
Yes.
Amarchand was designed as a residential building.
Correct.
And you
Yeah.
see the language changing in the same time frame, 1906 for both. So this is what, so that is the background of the owners and the architect.
Okay. Rajesh has asked if you can anyone can visit Afghan church, and I think anyone can now.
Anyone can.
Yeah,
It's open.
I was lucky enough to be at the opening. It was just amazing. It was really beautiful, and it
So
was
do ask for
traditional
looking at,
moment. Yeah.
whoever goes, do ask for looking at the original restored colors, the map, the
Okay.
flags,
Yeah.
the way they are restored. We are
Sure.
still to put a plaque there, but
Hmm.
one can, it is under lock and key
Yeah.
because they are museum items.
Correct. Okay. Suki has asked another question. What is the role of government in supporting conservation?
Sukhi, very simple. Legislation.
Hmm.
A very strong, smart legislation. A city began with legislation. This city was the first to set up legislation for conservation. So it took 100 steps forward. Today, it is taking 1,000 steps backward. I'm very sorry to say, but legislation.
Hmm. So do you
We
think
have Sonali here who's listening to this, and she's interior designer working on Amarchand in one of them, and she knows how much I harass her. And my trump card is legislation.
Yeah, I happily comply. Most happy to.
Yes.
There's another question, and I think it came during the slide of the Jama Masjid, which is who owns these buildings and are they owned privately?
They are owned by the Sunni Muslim Trust. It's a Juma Masjid Trust. It is owned by them. And they have many assets in the city. one of the biggest is the Kabristan at Marine Lines.
Okay. Yes, I see.
And all the Juma masjids are under the same trust,
Okay.
under the Waqf board, which is the Waqf board
Yes.
at the center.
Yes.
So they own
They
the,
own.
yeah,
Okay.
they're the owners.
Yeah. There is one more question. Are there books or guides written on heritage buildings in the fort area? And Taranjot also thanks you for this wonderful talk. But are there any books that people could read on the heritage buildings in the fort area in particular?
Yes. I think Mumbai is blessed with the maximum number of books on the fort precinct, written by architects, planners, historians. And they range from identification, understanding, to actual projects, design guidelines, which heritage asset owners can follow. So there are several books.
Okay.
which
Are there a couple that you could give us names of?
So the first one is it's called the Fort Precinct by Eminence, I think. I can send you a list
Sure. We can
which you can distribute. I'll give you a list.
sure, we can do that. We can do that.
Yes.
I think there are no more questions, but a lot of people have said that it was a really interesting talk, and being non-architects, it was really simple and easy to understand. So thank you very much for that.
That is what I aimed at.
Yes, I think, and that was, it really brought it alive for us. Jayesh has also said he's worked with you on the Afghan church, I think. Oh, no, maybe the Ismail building. And he said,
Yes. He restored the tiles.
okay, so he said it was an
Yes.
amazing experience to work with you as well.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
anyway, I think that's the end of our questions. And thank you so much. It was a really, really enlightening talk. And like I said, it was a great behind the scenes peek at these buildings and their history, and how much work goes into this. And what we don't see, we just see the final result, which always looks fabulous. But so thank you so much for doing this for the city, and thank you so much for your talk as well.
Thank you so much, Parina. And thank you, Sukhi, and everyone as a team at Khaki. You're always welcome.